My name is Thomas Messel, and I'm Oliver Messel's youngest nephew, and we developed a great friendship. Oliver Messel was probably the most celebrated English theatre designer in the history of English theatre. Oliver was born in 1904, and he was the youngest of 3 children, born and brought up in London and at Nyman's in Sussex. He studied fine art at the Slade, portraiture in particular, but what he liked doing in his spare time was his fascination for the masks of the ancient Greek theatre, how they would conceal or reveal an emotion. At weekends he'd make these wonderful masks out of papier-mâché and bits of wire. He gave an exhibition of these masks in the Claridge Gallery in Bruton Street in London, and Diaghilev and Charles B. Cochrane were guests at that exhibition, and they both commissioned Oliver to work for him. He had a very happy working relationship with Cochrane for 10 years, and he would be working with Noel Coward in particular, who was a great friend of Oliver's later on in life, George Balanchine, Victor Novello, Cecil Beaton, who was a friend and rival throughout his life. His zenith came in 1929 when he designed and created a production entirely of his own for Cochrane, and that was called Helen. And in that, for one scene, Oliver created a scene where everything was white, a colour that had never been used in the theatre before. White was not considered a theatre. And I remember Oliver telling me at the time, the walls of a buttery or a dairy would be white. They were kitchen colours, not for the house. And when Oliver's great friend, Ciri Morn, picked up the theme, it became a sort of design frenzy. So after the success of Helen, the world of film was calling him. And he worked for several years with George Cukor in England, which was, for example, on The Scarlet Pimpernel and The Thief of Baghdad, probably the best known of his early films. But then he was called to New York by MGM Studios, and he was asked to design in a space of probably 2 months the costumes that were needed for Romeo and Juliet. And this was going to be a launching of a new career in Hollywood for Norma Shearer and Leslie Howard. And the film then made him a household name, not only in America, but also in the United Kingdom. Towards the end of the war, in 1944, when it was quite clear that the Allies were going to win the war, Sidney Bernstein, who ran a propaganda department, asked Oliver if he would work with Gabriel Pascal, the French film director, to do the sets and costumes for Caesar and Cleopatra. And actually it was very much Vivian Lee's suggestion that Oliver did it. They'd worked together, they were very good friends. And Oliver used his skills of turning anything into an item of beauty, because there were no materials, there was nothing available in 1944. So he would use sweet papers, he would use pipe cleaners. Sellotape was wonderful because it has a lovely rippling effect to it. In 1946 and 1947, the war was coming to an end, and it was at this stage that Oliver was commissioned by Ninette de Valois to design the sets and costumes for the most important, most challenging piece of classical ballet in the world, which is The Sleeping Beauty by Tchaikovsky. The importance of this cannot be underestimated because it was going to be the opening performance of the Royal Ballet Company at Covent Garden. Before that, it hadn't existed. For the first time in 6 years, people saw colour, and they saw sparkle and everything. And the moment the curtain went up, Oliver's sets melted in with it beautifully. During the 1950s, it was a period known as the era of the neo-romantics. And this is where Oliver now redefined himself, not only as a stage designer, but also as an interior designer.
On the 8th floor of London's Dorchester Hotel, overlooking Hyde Park, stands a new penthouse heaven created by stage designer Oliver Messel. And this is the inside story of how a £50 a day dream suite is built from Messel's models.
The McAlpine family, who owned the Dorchester on Park Lane in London, invited him to create the most spectacular suite of rooms in the world to open in time in London for the Queen's coronation. This, in its day, was the most chic, sought-after and expensive hotel suite in the world, at £50 a night in 1953, if you could afford it. And it has been the haunt of Elizabeth Taylor and many of the Hollywood stars. His next major commission in interior design was for Sir Edward Raine of the great shoe company, Raine Shoes. And on Bond Street, he was opening what he said was going to be the prettiest shoe shop in the world. That's what Oliver had to do, and he certainly completed it in 1959. And it was in this shoe shop that one day a very, very charming lady called Phyllis Watkins came to buy her shoes. And she'd keep coming back, and she said to Edward Raine, "I love this so much. I would like to speak to Mr. Messel. Could you arrange for me to be introduced?" And Edward arranged an introduction. And she said to him, "We've just bought a house in Gloucestershire, and there are a couple of rooms I'd like you to do up." Well, for the next 15 years of Oliver's life, he was doing up, it was 22 bedrooms at Flaxley. It's enormous. It is without doubt the most deeply, hauntingly romantic house I've ever seen in my life. It has all the feelings of a medieval manor house, which was then enlarged in the Stuart and the Tudor periods, and it was filled as a treasure house, full of the most beautiful furniture and objets and paintings. And in 1960, when Oliver had just started working on Flaxley, his mother died, his father having died several years before. So now the contents of his beloved parental home were dispersed between the three siblings, Lindy, my father, Anne, his sister, and Oliver. Oliver chose items of furniture and furnishings that he thought might be appropriate for Flaxley, and Mrs. Watkins was thrilled to welcome these pieces of furniture, possessions and treasures of Oliver's into her home, because in a way it would inspire the house with his spirit as well, which it certainly had. Amongst those pieces that I remember was a lovely, lovely set of walnut early 18th century chairs which were made for Cardinal Altieri. They're beautifully carved with cabriole legs and a cartouche on the back of the Cardinal's coat of arms. And the morning room is a particular Oliver Messel room. It's got beautiful yellow silk-lined damask walls. The bookcases aren't bookcases in one case. You press a button and it swings open to a secret door that leads you into the drawing room that's off it. And there again, that room is 18th century, but it's very much furnished from Nyman's. The older part of the house has Oliver's furnishings as well. You'll find fabulous tapestries, again, which came from Nyman's, and I can remember these tapestries from a child where they were. There was the most beautiful early English oak cabinet inlaid with ivory or bone and beautifully painted. Apparently it was incredibly rare. And also the lovely pair of tables which used to belong to Emmeline Williams, the writer and actor who was a great friend of Oliver's. But also the dining chairs are chairs which Oliver designed in the Regency taste. They're very pretty, white, sort of ivory and green. Oliver at that stage had also decided to go and live on Barbados because he suffered very much from arthritis, and the climate of Barbados is more conducive for a comfortable way of living. He bought a ramshackled old plantation house on the west coast and recreated it with such taste and romance that it changed his career once again. He wanted to settle down and paint pictures and earn a living that way, but no, he couldn't, because everybody came to Maddox and they said, "Oh, Oliver, this is just so beautiful." And he was, for the rest of his life, designing houses all over the Caribbean, not only on Barbados, but he did one on Haiti, and he was best known, really, for Mustique as well, an island which was owned by Colin Tennant. As a wedding present, Colin Tennant gave Princess Margaret and Tony Snowdon a plot of land on Mustique. So she said to Colin, well, thank you for my wedding present, but where's the house? I want Oliver to design it for me. And so then, rather reluctantly, Colin Tennant realised it was going to cost him quite a lot for this wedding present. Oliver was brought over to design Les Jolies Eaux for Princess Margaret. And she absolutely adored it, and it remained her only house she owned, really, until more or less the end of her life. And it also started a friendship and working relationship between Colin and Oliver. And for the rest of his life, Oliver designed, I think, 36 houses in the Caribbean. In a way, Oliver was quite capable to reinvent himself as an architect when he went to live on the Caribbean, because as a theatre designer, he had initiated an idea which was new to him, and it's used now in the theatre constantly. It's the use of models. And the models that he used to do became the working, operative instruction model for everybody working on that project. And at Flaxley, he created the scale model of the existing building and then the incorporation of his new wing of a whole series of Regency arches. He was very, very proud of all his work in the Caribbean. When I knew him well, we'd spend the afternoons going around and looking at his work, talking to the owners, talking to the workshops where things were made. He was a genius with materials, finding ways of making things which would be cheaper or would employ people as well. And I think that Oliver had an ability to captivate people's minds, their eyes, to look to the distance, to look beyond, particularly in the Caribbean houses, what was around them, to look at the views, like a proscenium arch, really. This is what his life was like, was making you look beyond what is immediately near you to find something fascinating and romantic beyond that. And I think Flaxley certainly appealed to him in that respect, because it was a wonderful tapestry for him of different periods and different styles, and he could really put his entire heart and soul into that house. If you want to sum Oliver Messel's work up as a designer, he had the capacity to choreograph a room. This meant colour, it meant romance, and it meant wit.